Hey everyone, it's Jim
And Charles.
from Valves and More, an online vintage tube store. And today in Tube Lab number 192, we're going to talk a little bit about how to store your tubes safely. But first, caution everyone, electronics and tube amplifiers can have very high voltages present, which can be lethal. Exercise extreme caution when working around them. Always consult a professional technician when in doubt. Okay, now this may not be a very fun episode, but given how expensive and precious vintage tubes are, it's worth investing a little time and money into storing them safely. If you take care of your vintage tubes, you may well have them for a very long time. So, first of all, other than the pins and maybe a top cap or two, the entire electronics package is inside a glass envelope in a vacuum. So let's just take a quick look at this tube. This is a Tungsram PL36, and it's a TV power tube, and it's got a top cap. And not always, but normally when you have a top cap, you've got your high voltage, which is your anode, or we also call the anode the plate. So it connects up here. And of course, that keeps high voltage out of the more sensitive parts of the tube.
And helps in design because high voltage can arc across pins on the bottom of a base.
Yeah, exactly. Anyways, they're beautiful tubes. They're sort of, kind of, but not an EL34. They were designed around the same time period. And they've got a weird heater voltage too.
Yeah. This is the PL36, not the EL36. So it has a 25 volt heater on it, which is weird these days.
But this is not a young tube. It's not ancient. We will be looking at fairly ancient tubes in a few minutes. But have a look at this tube. Now, it's been in bulk storage for probably 60 years. And other than, the paint fading a little bit, this tube with full gettering, so that tells us right away that the vacuum inside is absolutely perfect. So, and even actually the top cap's in good shape. Usually these are tinned brass, and these can corrode and tarnish, and they need to be cleaned up. The pins can corrode and tarnish, and they need to be cleaned up. But the electronics inside, look at that. They're inside this glass envelope. There's a glass underneath here. And in fact, if you have a metal tube, there's glass inside the metal tube. Mm-hmm. All the metal is doing is just protecting the glass.
Yeah, and as long as the glass is intact and the vacuum is intact, nothing is happening to the components on the inside. They will stay static and the way they were when they were made until you use them.
Which is why a tube that's 70 or even 100 years old can work just fine today and even sound as good as it did when it was brand new. Now, you can't say that about solid-state electronics, let me tell you. So at the end of this episode, we'll be looking at some new old stock Sylvania bad boys that are now 70 to 80, even a little older than 80 years old, if you can imagine that. And they sound fantastic. Now, in our business, we store tubes in bulk, in flat-bottom Ziploc bags, inside medium-sized clear storage bins, and we have a lot of them. But we don't store tubes in a heated space. Now, mind you, we live in the Pacific Northwest, so our climate is fairly temperate. But tubes really don't care too much about being stored at 0 degrees C or F, or at 20 degrees Celsius or 72 Fahrenheit. What they probably don't like, though, is if you store them in an unheated space and you bring them in to a warm room and you plug them in and then fire them up. That's not a good idea.
Especially if there's any flaws or damage to the glass at all, or if it has a lot of connections that go through the glass. Because it's going to go from something that's very constricted, the glass, to expanding quite rapidly.
Yeah. Now, they may well survive. I mean, there were 6v6s in car and truck radios for decades. And I used to live in a very cold winter climate, so well below zero, and those tubes would have had to have been able to cope with that spec. So
Yeah, going from freezing to warming up in minutes.
yeah. So
Still, it's a good idea to be careful of that and not, take a chance, especially not with nice vintage tubes.
yeah. So if your tubes are cold in a cold storage area and you're bringing them into play, just bring them in a few hours ahead of time and let them come up to room temperature all on their own. Okay. Now I've got a bag. Hang on. Let's just clear the decks here. I've got a bag that's typical that we use. Now, let me just back up here so you can see this. Now, this is a typical bag of one type of tube, how we store in bulk. Now, this is something that most of you are not going to be doing because you don't have a tube business. But the reason I'm showing you these bags is they're Ziplocs and they're heavy duty, so they're designed for freezer storage, and
They have a gusset on the bottom.
they got flat bottoms. Now, if you only have a few tubes, you don't need a gusset, but the gusseted bags are fabulous. You can really put a nice load in them. But here's the big thing. If you live anywhere near a difficult environment, particularly on an ocean, so on any saltwater body whatsoever, or a body with a lot of humidity, or temperature changes, putting your tubes inside Ziplocs will help a lot, particularly with saltwater corrosion. Even if you're a couple of kilometers or a couple of miles inland from the ocean, you probably know this really well. Anything that'll corrode will corrode. So anyways, Ziplocs are really fabulous. They're inexpensive and they'll help a lot. Now, Charles, you made up what we think is a good, simple method for storing a set of tubes for an amp.
Yeah, let me grab it here. So this is a representative set of boxes for something like a Wilsonton R8, and maybe you have a preamp that takes some 12AU7s on the side here. So with a Wilsonton R8, you would have 9 tubes in total. You'd have your 4 EL34 power tubes, and these are some beautiful Telefunken branded boxes for RFT tubes. Let's just take a quick look at that.
Yeah, they're gorgeous. And you have a box fetish, don't you?
Oh, I absolutely love them. Love the vintage boxes, which is important to talk about because they aren't going to be around forever, and the better you store them, the better they're going to last.
Well, last week I actually saw somebody had for sale a rebranded tube that was called Zoltron.
Yeah,
with a
that was weird.
with a weird lightning bolt, and it's not a tube that we would sell or use. But I almost
just for that.
I almost bought you the tubes just so you could have the boxes.
Yeah. So we've got some vintage 6SN7 and 6SL7 boxes here, and these are great examples of GE boxes, but we don't typically see them in this kind of condition because these are getting fairly old now as well. I believe they probably stopped being made in the early 70s.
Oh God, the blue box? No, I think the blue box probably comes from the early 1960s.
Mm-hmm. And here's a Sylvania 6SL7, and you'll often see them taped, just like this, because as you open and close these boxes, this thin cardboard that was really only designed to hold the tube long enough to get it into your house and get it into your piece of equipment, it fails. It falls apart, it breaks. And if you want to keep the box somewhat intact, people tape them. We don't actually have a lot of nice Sylvania 6SL7 or 6SN7 boxes anymore because they fall apart.
A lot of them are actually in pieces when we get them. Mm-hmm. But are you saying that manufacturers 70 years ago didn't design cardboard boxes to last?
No. I mean, think about any product that you buy today that's disposable. Do you expect the cardboard that your light bulb comes in to last 100 years? Probably not. So, frankly, it's amazing that these are in the condition that they're in.
Though we probably new old stock tubes that come in the box, we probably lose at least half of the boxes. They have to be chucked.
Yeah, they fall apart so much, and I'll show you a couple of those in a second. But anytime that we have an octal tube that needs a box, this is what we're sending out with them. We get these are new manufactured craft paper boxes. We try to label them whenever possible, although obviously we can't have labels for every type that's out there. And these are just a little bit bigger than the standard Octo boxes, and we do that so you can actually add a layer of bubble wrap on the inside to give it a little bit of extra padding, and that's how we ship them.
That's right. And we are constantly looking for new packaging because it's a bigger and bigger issue. And Charles just found
Boxes about this size here.
Yeah.
Let me take these out. So
a little bigger than that for a miniature 9-pin. So
Yeah.
we'll be able to start, if those boxes work out, we're just doing a trial. So I only
we'll
brought
be
in
able to
100.
do something similar as with these guys. Yeah.
So we're trying to get to the point where tubes will arrive with boxes because up until recently, when I first started the business, there were a lot of boxes around, but not anymore. So there's been a couple of years in which we've been shipping a lot of tubes just in bubble wrap.
Yeah.
So anyways,
we try to send boxes when we have them, and we try to find generics if we can.
Yeah. We're working on that.
And a lot of tubes, unfortunately, also never came with boxes. So let me grab an example
Well,
here.
hang on. So this is a good, we have a lot of shallow flat cardboard trays and boxes like this where we store specific sets of empty boxes or sets of tubes.
Yeah.
In fact, you've got one somewhere. Where have you got it? Oh yeah, here it is. This is an example of how we would store a whole set of Tungsram E80cc's. And we'll be talking actually about these tubes and the Philips version because, well, frankly, I found a whole bunch that we didn't even know we had.
And you can see even with these ones, these all came in on the same lot, and some of them are absolutely beautiful, but other ones are showing signs of damage. And this is just how they were stored before they got to us. See that?
But we made up this little box, and it's the cheapest, quickest way to organize a little batch of tubes. You can do it by amp, you can do it by tube type, and just customize a little box. I threw a little bit of shipping tape around it to reinforce it. The most important thing to remember is that you can't put your tubes in a position in which they can be broken.
Yeah.
We have a rule on our benches and in the labs here that you don't move a tube unless you're actually paying attention and focused on moving the tube.
And we have a general purpose carrier here that we like to use. This is our standard container that we use for practically everything being moved around. And yeah, it's a yogurt container.
Hey, it's an organic yogurt.
But they've got nice handles. They're deep. They can store a lot of tubes, and they're safe to move quantities around in.
Yeah. So when we're moving, let's say, a matched pair of tubes from the lab over to the listening room, we don't carry them in our hands. I used to do that.
And how many tubes did we lose?
Not that many, but I guess if you add them up, there's, there were a few.
Yeah.
So now, we actually have a saying to each other, which is
No droppy.
no droppy.
Yeah.
And if you plan to move your tubes, even if it's from a work area to a bench to clean off a label or something like that, you don't do anything else. Your job is to move the tube safely from one place to the next place.
And don't try to hold a big pile of tubes with just your fingers,
No.
just one hand or two hands. You're going to drop something. You're going to slip. You're going to break a whole bunch of them. It's going to be a big mess.
That's where some kind of transfer tub is golden. Even at home, even if you only have a dozen tubes, have a transfer tube in every area that you handle tubes, and then you just move around your tub of tubes.
Yep. Could be a little tub, could be a little box, could be anything really.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to...
How tubes
Yeah.
how tubes arrive and how tubes are stored commercially.
Yeah, so this is a bulk case of 6N6Ps.
So it's got its original Cyrillic label.
Any guess where it came from? CCCP.
Yeah. So these are Soviet era tubes.
So let's pop this open and we'll see how these are stored. And to be fair, for a bulk package, these are actually stored quite nicely. We've got thick cardboard, and it's held up fairly well over the years. We actually have some neat data sheets here on top as well. This was something that they commonly did. They give out a bunch of these little slip data sheets.
Only the Soviets did that.
And Oh, let me tilt that so you can actually see inside. Here are our tubes. So this is a partial case of 6N6Ps, and you can see every one of them is stored in its own little sleeve down in here. So they can't bump against each other. They can't move very far, although, you know, if this was bouncing around in the back of a Lotta, you might bend the pins a little bit on them. But this is a fairly safe way to store them, and you can stack them fairly high like this.
Yeah, and bulk tubes will come stored, depending on how big the tube is and the tube type and the manufacturer, they'll come stored 25, 50, and 100. And I think I've seen small tubes in 200 packs, so there'll be 2 layers of
if these weren't such a small tube, there'd be enough space in here for 2 layers of 9 pins.
Yeah, and I think this is a 100 pack, this one. Yeah.
And you can see how they've made up these dividers. They're very simple, and this is actually something that you could do at home if you wanted to with some basic cardboard and some time. And you could separate out tubes if you had a large number of them like this.
That's right. Well, you could even make a custom divided, inexpensive cardboard box. Just make up your own dividers. I mean, God, there's so much cardboard in this world. It's amazing. You know, these tubes here. Did we get a date code on?
Oh, it's probably on the top here somewhere.
Did they date it? I don't think so. But these are probably from about 1970. So that
let's
makes.
Just check a tube. These are all actually dated. That's 1982.
Right. Okay, so they're actually not that old. So these are about 42 years old. But they were well stored, and in fact, in our little warehouse, this is how we would just receive and store them.
Yeah, until we needed to test them. But all these tubes, whenever we've tested and matched them, they go into a plastic bag, into a freezer bag, just like we showed you earlier, matched up with testing numbers, with the bag labeled, so we know exactly where they are, they're ready to go.
And sometimes we have a date-matched lot like this, and sometimes we don't. But if we've got a lot of tubes of the same date, we actually make the listing. Let me get these in there.
Yeah.
We'll make a listing and we'll say, all 1982 or whatever.
Okay, so what happens whenever you don't store your boxes properly? Well, first thing to be aware of is if you are planning on pulling out your tubes from your boxes fairly regularly, it's probably a better idea to leave them outside of the box so that you don't damage them. Now, the more modern the box is, the more it's going to be able to handle some abuse, but the older they get, the more brittle they get. And here's a couple of 7F7 examples. And this isn't a particularly valuable or interesting box, so I just pulled out an old 7F7, and look at that. That's all it takes. And I'm barely putting any pressure on this at all.
So unless this was an historically important tube, we would just throw that box away. Well, we'd recycle it.
Well, we would have probably tried to save something like this if it was a Sylvania tube box or something like that. Here's a military box. Same idea, probably from around the same era. This one is dated for 1944, amazingly. So this is World War II era. And you can see...
Yeah, it's just falling apart.
Yeah, and this is probably due to a mixture of age and humidity. So if you live in a high humid, what am I trying to say here? A high humidity area. Okay, there we go.
Region.
Yeah. It'll damage these boxes. They'll soak it up over time. They'll get soft. They've got this sort of pliable softness to them. They aren't crisp like you'd expect a newer box to feel like. And they'll just dissolve like this. I mean, we've opened up boxes where it's literally just powder that they've turned into.
So what we do with historically important boxes is we don't use them to store the tubes. And in fact, you've probably, if you've bought from us tubes in which we had boxes like that, we'll put them in the box, ship them out to you on the side so that you don't use them. But they're there. They're interesting to have. You can keep them as part of your collection.
Yeah, they're decorative. You can put them on display. Just don't try to use them regularly for storage. They're not good for that anymore. You're going to destroy the box, and you're going to end up with something like that.
Well, or the tube could fall out because it's not the ends are not a proper closure.
If these ends fall off, then there's nothing stopping the tube from coming out of here.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that wasn't that much fun, but Charles has got a whole bunch of really high quality vintage tubes that some of them we actually had large quantities in stock that we didn't even know. So why don't you start off with those Philips E80cc's?
Yeah. Look at these beautiful tubes. So the E80cc is sort of like a very high-end 12AU7. It's probably one of the most premium versions of a 12AU7 ever made. And it looks absolutely nothing like one other than being a 9-pin dual triode.
And it can often be used in circuit. It's not a perfectly compatible tube. So in some circuits, it's not going to work properly. But in many circuits, it actually works quite well.
It is going to draw more heater current, and it does pass more current at the same operating point as a 12AU7. But as long as your power supply can handle that, it should work just fine.
Yeah, the filament current, or heater current, that's the biggie you've got to be careful of. Because if you burn out your filament windings on your transformer, well, you've destroyed your transformer. So.
And we pulled these out recently because we actually have been selling a few pairs of them, and we discovered more that we had that we didn't realize, because a few of our customers are actually building their own versions of our E80cc kit preamp.
Which is an amazing sounding preamp. It never took off. We sold a number of them, but most people go with the Universal 6 or 12 SN7 simply because it can roll so many different kinds of tubes, whereas the E80cc can roll
one kind.
Yeah.
And I think there's only really two versions of it, and we've got both of them on screen right here. This is the Tungsram version of the E80cc. Very similar in appearance and build.
Developed a little bit later, and probably broke the patent rules, but it was built in a former East Bloc country, so they could get around that. And it sounds almost identical to the Philips version of the tube. Philips, of course, invented the E80cc, and just shortly after the Second World War ended, I think around 1947 or 48, if my memory serves, Tungsram probably introduced this tube in the early 1960s, though I don't have any date codes for them. We have quite a few of these new old stock Tungsrams in stock, and they are great. Great tubes.
As you can tell from the boxes we showed earlier.
Yeah, I got, actually, it's an interesting story. I got lucky. I found a wholesaler in South America who I think was cleaning up an older gentleman's commercial radio supply. That it was sort of a mail order business for all of South America, and they had a lot of these Tungsram E80cc's. And I made a deal. I bought them all. I bought the entire inventory out of the warehouse, and we've been selling them over the years. And I took a chance because you never know. Sometimes you don't have buyer protection, but they answered all my questions. Well, the boxes look so good. I said, "Are those reproduction boxes?"
Actually, let's pull one of them out.
I am a suspicious buyer because the rule today is if you buy tubes in which somebody's made a reproduction box, there's a good chance that you've got a problem seller. Stay away from people that make reproduction boxes. It's almost always bad news.
Anytime they're trying to dress up the tube with something, they're probably trying to hide a flaw with it electrically.
Yeah. See how perfect some of the boxes were?
Yeah.
And no, the gentleman said, no, they've been stored in a proper electronics warehouse, and that's the way we found them.
That's what a good, well-stored box looks like.
Yeah. Unfortunately, vintage tubes go through all sorts of phases of storage. Soviet tubes go... The worst case scenario for a Soviet tube is in the trunk of a Lada.
Yep.
And the Lada's still on the road.
Or in a warehouse that was forgotten since the collapse and allowed, rain to seep through. And
somebody probably stole the windows and doors off of it.
Subjected to the harsh Russian winters and.
Yeah. So, Anyways, what else have you got, Charles?
Well, just to go back to these guys real quick. So we did find more of them. We've been testing and clearing them, and we do actually have some beautiful tight matched pairs in the store if you are interested in these guys. Not just for our E80cc preamp, but also for other amps that will run a 12AU7.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good tube that in Europe, it was commonly found in studios as a standard preamp tube. So that tells you a lot. If a recording studio likes the tube, it's an industrial multi-purpose tube, so it was used in industry as well. So anyways, it's one of my favorite tubes. I just wish there were more manufacturers and they were more affordable, but that's the way the cookie crumbles.
And here's something that we've gotten in some decent quantities lately, and this is the absolutely beautiful 12SN7 bad boy made by Sylvania. So this, of course, is the 12-volt version of the famous 6-volt 6SN7 bad boy.
So you can't run it in a standard 6SN7 socket. It's one of our most common purchase errors.
Yep. We might actually end up separating out the 12-volt tubes at some point into a different listing just because of how often people don't read what they're clicking on and accidentally buy a 12-volt tube instead.
But we've got so much.
There's too much to do, though.
So much development work. So many new amps in the pipeline.
Yeah. So this is a great example of what can happen to a new old stock tube over time. Though we picked up a decent number of these that were new old stock, but they were bulk packed, essentially loose. And they were loose because either the boxes had disintegrated over time or because these are Jan marked tubes. So these were military tubes. They may have been bulk packed just like I showed you in the case earlier, like the 6N6Ps.
Probably.
And the boxes disintegrated. And this is how you find them sometimes. And these are just perfect. The pins are perfect. The gettering is perfect. The testing numbers,
yeah,
doesn't get much closer to new old stock than that.
Yeah, and we've got a couple of universal amps that use that are not voltage dependent for the filaments. So the standard octal 6-volt tube and the equivalent 12-volt tube can run in those amps. And since we developed those universal amps, more and more manufacturers have caught on. And
they're offering either a switch or the ability to bring in a switch mode like us, and it's great. We love to see it. We love to see other manufacturers branching out and making use of these fantastic tubes that are still available.
Yeah, this is the whole reason. These are probably some of the very best 6SN, or in this case 12SN7 tubes ever made, period. The only problem is that they're the first generation lower spec GT. So even if you had the 6SN7 GT, it will not play safely in most modern equipment unless it was designed for that. A lot of manufacturers, and this is something to keep in mind, a lot of manufacturers say, "Oh yeah, it works just fine. You can use those," and they didn't even bother looking at the data sheet. A really large manufacturer of preamps did exactly that, and then we started losing a lot of really premium tubes. Customers they got noisy,
and then we stopped selling them to those customers that had those amps because you'd kill a tube in a week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And something else that's coming that's another really quite old tube. This is an unbased Lochtel tube. We'll be probably doing an episode on this particular tube in the near future. This is the 7F7. So this is exactly inside here electrically, it's exactly the components of the 6SL7 GT, a very important high gain tube from the 1940s, 50s into the 60s. And these will get rebased like this as Lochtels. And this is the what we call the heavy chrome dome version. There's a full chrome dome version that's a very early tube. And anyways, I don't want to spend too much time on that, but these are pin and electrical compatible once they're rebased with the 6SL7s. And
their octal equivalents are extremely difficult to find now.
Yeah, they're basically extinct. I used to specialize in them, and I had a lot of them in stock, and I've sold a lot over the years.
We may have a small number of them left, but not many.
Yeah, but these sound amazing, and we'll have some more in the store, and we'll probably talk a little bit more and do an episode on them. They're anytime you have a special tube that's used commonly throughout amplifiers, So high gain tubes are fairly rare. There's only a few of them in use, the 6SL7 and the 12AX7 and the 12AT7 to a lesser extent. I'm not a huge fan of the sound of the 12AT7 or the 12AX7, but the 6SL7s, wow.
Well, it strikes that great balance between gain and warmth.
Yeah.
Yeah, at least with the Sylvania versions.
Yeah. These Lochtel tubes, 99% of them were all made by Sylvania. Okay, well, if you stayed to the very end, here's some discount codes to help you out. And a big thank you to everybody who participated in our annual summer sale. It ended last Sunday, and holy smokes,
It was a huge turnout.
were we busy. We gave away thousands of dollars in large discount chunks. And I'm always glad. It's our way of saying thank you to our customers, you, our viewers, for supporting the business. It gives you a chance to stock up on expensive tubes that you normally couldn't afford, or to buy spares. And I think a lot of people suddenly realized, wait a minute, they've still got a lot of vintage EL34s in match quads.
We sold a lot of vintage
Oh my
34s.
God, did we ever sell a lot of EL34s.
That's great. It's so nice being able to help you guys have great sound out of your systems.
So we can reach almost everybody around the world with flat rate $20 shipping. But if your order is $150 or more after discount, the shipping is on us, folks. And even though we're not running a sale again for a long time, we run 2 sales a year. That's it. And some spot sales occasionally if we have too much or something special to sell. But you can use a code. And somebody, I think 2 days after the sale, ended grabbed the $50 code. Whoa, I gave that away. Oh, that's a big hint. Anyways, stay safe, everyone. This is Jim.
And Charles.
Signing off. Cheers, everyone.